What's going on, gang? Coach Joe here. The other guy's Dr. Danny. The other guy we're so fired up to have is Robb Wolf in the podcast. Robb's a father, husband, New York Times best-selling author, tinkers in Jazillion Jiu-Jitsu. And dang it, guys, we got him here on the show. I'm fired up to have you, Robb. I told you before the show, I thought you invented podcasting. It was cool. Yours was the only show I listened to for the first 3 years I did it. So we're really fired up to talk to you about this wired to eat concept and kind of just hash out some guy talk, not about small penises. So we won't do that. We'll avoid that.
I'm definitely nervous.
Fired up.
And I am super old, so I can appreciate that. I could be regarded as possibly starting podcasting, but it did exist even before I did. So,
well, I thought you were one of the first ones too, and I remember listening to your podcast when I was at Schofield Barracks when I was still in the military, and actually you answered a question I had about drinking breast milk, and I started pounding breast milk after that because my wife had this leftover breast milk. I wanted to go to waste, and you said, sure, I'll be making some breast milk lattes, so that's what I did. So I appreciate the advice.
Impressive. I'm glad I could help with that.
That's right. That was years ago. But no, this is great. No, we're so excited to have you on here. I know. I mean, most people probably know who you are, Robb. And for those who don't, would you just mind giving them a kind of quick backstory about who you are, and then the new book that you're coming out with this month that we're really excited to chat with you about.
Sure. So I've always been interested in health and human performance. Maybe almost in self-defense. Like, both my parents were quite sick when I was growing up. Both of them smoked. My dad drank. Both of them were overweight. They didn't exercise. And I just had this sneaky suspicion that I didn't want to age the way that I was watching my parents age. And this was when they were still in their mid-30s, early 40s. Like, I didn't even see the real impact of the decrepitude that was going to hit these guys, diabetic amputations, wound care, advanced autoimmune diseases. I remember my parents being the age that I am now and thinking, man, those guys are really old, but I was really in for a treat when they actually got really old. So long and short of that, I've always been interested again in trying to find a way to optimize health and performance. I was a California state powerlifting champion a long time ago. Dabbled with some Thai boxing. I'm still doing some Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I did an undergrad in biochemistry and was trying to figure out if I wanted to do medical school or a research track, but it was right around this time that I had a pretty serious health problem. I had ulcerative colitis so bad that, right now I'm about 175 pounds, reasonably lean, reasonably muscular. The ulcerative colitis was so bad that I was down to 130 pounds due to malabsorption. I mean, I was dying for all intents and purposes. And it's kind of an interesting set of circumstances, but this idea of a paleo diet got on my radar. I started researching that, started experimenting with it, and it was like flipping a switch. Like, it was the most profound health experience that I'd ever had. I'd basically been sick my whole youth and young adult life up until that point. Probably some grain intolerances, some insulin resistance. I tend to be, I function best at that lower carb side of things, 75, 150 grams a day. And so all of that really influenced me a lot. And I had a really interesting opportunity too. I was right around 2000, 2001, I was cruising around the internet, as people have a tendency to do. And I found this wacky workout called CrossFit. And I started fiddling around with it with my friend Dave Warner. He's a retired Navy SEAL. And before we knew it, we had about 20 people training with us out of his garage.
Yeah.
And we contacted the Glassmans and said, hey, we want to open a gym, want to call it CrossFit. Do we have your blessing? And they said, yes, go be achieve. And so that was the first CrossFit affiliate in the world. And then I moved down to Chico, California, and opened up NorCal Strength and Conditioning, which was the fourth CrossFit affiliate in the world. And so people that like CrossFit think that's kind of a cool story. People that hate it think I'm the Antichrist because I help them spread it faster than syphilis on a college campus. But it provided me a really interesting opportunity to work with a lot of people and take what was the theory between my ears about sleep, food, exercise, community, and actually put it into practice. And that led to the first book that I wrote, The Paleo Solution, which has done really well. Like, I'm really, really fortunate. 6, almost 7 years later, it's still selling well. It still seems to help a lot of people. But over the course of time, I saw a lot of limitations with what that message was putting forward. And one of the primary pieces is that, and we talked about this a little bit before we started rolling, ideally we want the message that we're trying to share with people to be as simple as possible.
Sure.
Like, you don't want to blow people out of the water. This isn't a deal of like, showing people how smart you are with how many metabolic pathways you can recite. It's trying to figure out how to tell people actionable things that they can do. And so on the one hand, we try to keep these messages really simple, and paleo and low carb and stuff like that, and even vegan for that matter. It's very simple. It's like, here's the lane lines, stay in those lane lines, and you're good to go. The challenge there, though, is that these broad applications only apply to certain people. So we've got a bell curve, and we've got a chunk of people in the middle that low carb works for. And then as you start getting more and more outside the normal distribution, there are fewer and fewer people for which this general recommendation works particularly well. So we need to find some ability to get more granular, get more detailed, and find a way to help people really, dial in what their individual needs are. So that's a lot of the implementation part of the book. I have a 30-day reset that is basically focused at reversing insulin resistance and systemic inflammation. And we follow that with a 7-day carb test so that we can get people really dialed in on what exactly their body does with different amounts and types of carbohydrates. Now, on the front end of the book, I'm talking a lot about the neuroregulation of appetite, because the biggest challenge that I've found for folks that peel out of diet and lifestyle changes is that they really just kind of outthink themselves. They get into a process, they discover that it's a bit challenging, and they assume that there's something wrong with them, like that they're broken or they're lacking like moral fiber or something. And when I really started, it's funny because I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but people will tell you what the thing is that you need to focus on next.
Sure.
And I'm an idiot. And so like I had people telling me for years, they're like, I just feel like this is hard. I feel like a failure. And I'm like, no, that's silly. Evolutionary biology, blah, 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 and I had this really kind of like off the cuff response. And then it literally was a couple of years and a very interesting paper that talked about the evolution of our brain and the omnivore's real dilemma and the neuroregulation of appetite. And this thing was like, it put all this stuff together that people have been trying to tell me, where they're like, hey man, I'm struggling because I have this sense that all this should be easier, and when it's not easy, I think that the problem is with me. And this thing was able to, this paper put all this in a context where then I was able to circle back around and tell a story about our neuroregulation of appetite, and why, if you expect to live in this modern environment of hyperpalatable foods, 24/7 entertainment, addictive social media, and you think that it would be easy to decouple from that, you're nuts, And so you're not a failure if you find all that stuff appealing. All of that stuff's been engineered to be literally tasty, whether we're talking about social media or modern processed food. And it doesn't mean that we need to accept that state, but we need to get to a spot where we say, okay, I understand that these things are really addictive, really compelling, but now here's what we're going to do to decouple from that and get rid of the emotionality and actually move forward and get healthy.
So I think that's interesting, and you bring up folks kind of giving you hints and what to focus on. And I'm constantly told by my wife, do the dishes, do that stuff. So it's a little easier in that because she's a little bit more direct with me in that regard. But it is tough, and it seems like the opening of the book is kind of this like goodwill hunting moment where it's like, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And as I'm, kind of looking through, I'm like, okay, it's not. And you build this good case. So talk to us about the structure of these modern foods, because we've heard it. Or maybe if you're listening to some other folks talking about the food's just engineered to get us. So can we get an example of some of these? I bet you can't have it. I bet you just can't eat one type foods that are just wire our brain to just eat, right?
Well, let's take a step back maybe one layer further. And
Okay.
Even though I'm not couching this whole story from that kind of Paleolithic perspective, it still is really deep with evolutionary biology, ancestral health. Like, I still think that this is a incredibly helpful framework to look at this stuff, to start asking questions. And when we look at the way that our neuroregulation of appetite was forged in the past, we're opportunistic omnivores. Humans eat anything that's not nailed down, and then we rest. Like, that's the basic thermodynamics of this story, the kind of economics. There's this concept called optimum foraging strategy, which is basically get as many calories and nutrition, elements as you can, burning as little energy as you can. And if you stay in the net positive with that, then you're going to continue to live. And if you end up needing to burn more calories consistently than what you obtain, you're going to die. So we have woven into our genetics this tendency to both seek out lots and lots of food, but also to be what we would call lazy, because that was a good strategy in the past. Like you didn't, get some food and then go for a run and burn it all off because you didn't know if you were going to eat again for 3 or 4 days.
Well, it's the path of least resistance, right? I mean, to some degree, it's a survival mechanism, right?
Yeah, and any free-living organism, like if you look at a lizard or a hawk or ants, they practice optimum foraging strategy. They're not out like doing jumping jacks to burn off excess
exercising.
Calories. Really not, excess calories in the natural world. We, via technology and culture, we've been able to amass enormous amounts of excess calories, and there's great laudable elements to that. But the challenge is that not only are we facing a huge glut of excess calories, the food producers have sat down and really thought about, okay, what makes something addictive?
Sure.
What makes something just such that, like the Lay's potato chips, bet you can't eat just one. And man, I'll take that bet all day long.
That's right.
And it depends on the person. Like some people are really triggered by kind of sweet stuff. I'm more of a salty, crunchy person, so that sea salt and vinegar potato chip, like it doesn't matter if it's a 5-ounce bag or a 50-pound bag, I'm going to eat the whole bag.
Crush it.
And there's really no off switch with that. And the really about the only advice or response that we get out of mainstream medicine, particularly the dietetic scene, and this isn't all of them, the things are changing slowly, but we get these two kind of folk advice pieces that seem really reasonable, but I think are actually failing us. The first one is eat less, move more. Push away from the table, get up, go do a walk, all that type of stuff. And there's great wisdom in that, but it actually flies exactly in the face of the way that we're genetically wired, which is to eat more and
move less.
So on a fundamental level, this folk wisdom that seems really good is ignoring our basic genetic wiring. That's one piece. And then the other piece is we're told everything in moderation. But when you walk down the snack aisle of the supermarket, or I live in Reno, Nevada, so like I'm surrounded by buffets. What is moderation in a buffet when you literally have like 45 desserts, to say nothing of like 18 to 20 different meat and fish options and salads and soft serve ice cream? Like there really is no moderation in that scenario. And so the two primary bits of advice that seem really intuitive and seem really, reasonable are just abject failures. And so this is really about the only thing that we're given to try to navigate this modern food environment. And all the while, the people who I'm working on a blog post right now that talks about how social media is created, and the people who do the programming and develop things like Twitter and Facebook, they study evolutionary biology, evolutionary medicine, to figure out how to make things addictive, basically to spin the dopamine centers in the brain and make you want to come back and look at the next page. And the people who manufacture our food are quite well versed in evolutionary biology and the neuroregulation of appetite, and they figure out how to bypass that stuff. So the people who you could argue are profiteering from this whole process really understand this ancestral health story at a deep level. And then the bulk of our gatekeepers who are supposed to be helping us still ignore and fight this ancestral health story. They're still like, I don't know if we can really learn anything from anthropology and looking at hunter-gatherers and stuff like that. Whereas the people who are making money off this process are incredibly well-versed in it. Yeah.
Well, you bring up a good point. That's kind of our genetics, and you have kids. We all have kids on the podcast, and I remember the first time that my son got like true refined sugar introduced to him. It was at Christmas, and my wife's grandmother stuck her finger into like a peach cobbler and then shoved it in his mouth. And I think he was like 1 year old, right? And his eyes lit up, and he got this like crazy look in his eyes, like a wild man. And so I mean, it's definitely there, right? It's not a learned habit. And with kids, it sounds like it's even more of a challenge, right? So you have a couple kids, what's the strategy going to be for you to really set your kids up in the right way to have healthy habits the rest of their life in terms of nutrition?
Man, a really good question, and it's a constantly moving target that we're trying to figure out. One thing is that we just basically try to have good options at all the meals, and we have experimented with some of these more hyper-palatable foods. Like I remember the first time that Nikki made some Christmas cookies, and she had Zoe help her, and these were like some almond flour Christmas cookies. They're really good. They're like snickerdoodles. But prior to this, Zoe had tried some ice cream, she tried some gluten-free cake, but this stuff was so sweet that she had a couple of bites of it, and she's like, "Man, I'm good. I'm totally good." It was so over the top that it wasn't really appealing to her. But these Christmas cookies had just the right amount of sweet, and it had a little salt, and it had some crunch. And I tell you, a year and a half later, she was still like, "Mama, when are we making Christmas cookies?" And she was a year old. She barely had spoken language at this point. And she remembered that stuff. And I was relating this story on social media, trying to talk to people about, hey, if you expose yourself to hyperpalatable foods, you shouldn't be surprised that they're really hard to avoid. But what this turned into was this big, inner child massaging session of, oh, well, she just associated it with Christmas and, the holidays. I'm like, no. She's a year old. She's not waxing nostalgic about the holidays yet. This is a hyper-palatable food that is in the right frequency band. Like ice cream was too much. Gluten-free cake was too much. But this thing was just crack-like enough above what we normally eat, but it wasn't too much such that it was really almost this kind of gateway drug kind of thing for her. So, the long and short of all that is, in general, we just try to have good options in the house. I'm totally gluten intolerant. I have celiac disease, so we don't have gluten in the house. We don't eat gluten when we eat out. Both girls have been exposed to gluten via birthday parties and stuff. They don't seem to react at all the way that I do, but we just generally don't give it to them. We let it pop up, and I don't make a huge deal out of it. If they did really react to it, then we would have another layer of issues to deal with. But if we have something like we're gonna have some dark chocolate for kind of a dessert type of thing, they have to eat all their veggies, they have to eat all their meat, they have to eat all the whatever stuff, and then they can have some of this kind of treaty type thing. But we don't. One thing that we haven't done, we haven't used food as a reward. We don't really emotionalize around it. And I'm also really honest. When I go to work, the girls are like, "Dada, what do you do for work?" And I'm like, "I try to help people eat better so they can be healthy and not get sick." And they're like, "Okay." And so they have a pretty good grasp at 4 years old and 2.5 years old that, food can either make you healthy or can make you not feel so good. It is interesting, though. Zoe really tends to take after Nikki. She's our oldest, and then Sagan tends to take after me, both in kind of looks and affect and everything. Sagan barely will touch carbs. I mean, we'll do some gluten-free waffles or something like that, and she pushes it around the plate, and then she'll literally look at me and she'll say, "Dada, can I have some butter?" And I take some grass-fed butter, cut it like a piece of cheese, and she'll eat 3 or 4 pieces.
Nice.
Zoe, by contrast, though, will eat all of her gluten-free pancakes. Sagan's pancakes. She doesn't really have an off switch with it, but it's interesting. Nikki is far more naturally insulin sensitive than I am. We could sit down and eat the same amount of carbs. It would completely crush me. I would be laying under the table, almost comatose, and I'll ask Nikki, "Hey, are you feeling carb-headed?" And she's like, "Yeah, I'm a little foggy-headed," but then she's fine, and I'm sick for 3 days.
Huh.
So there's a huge slice of individual response and all that, and we haven't seen that played out so much with regards to behavior with the girls, because they generally eat pretty darn well, but we have noticed a really big difference in the predilection that they have for seeking out certain foods. But we, from an early point, we introduced liver and kimchi and sauerkraut, and these girls eat damn near everything. Both of them again have more predilections one way versus the other, but we didn't give them kid food. We didn't give them goldfish and easily chewable stuff. We make them use their teeth. If they want a snack, it's jerky or apples or pecans or something like that. And by and large, like they've just done really well. They're at 98th percentile on height. They're at like 30 or 40th percentile on weight. So they're tall and skinny. They've knock on wood, they've developed really well. And part of that's been luck, and part of that's been, just giving them a good environment.
Well, you put the work in with it, and I think one of your earlier podcasts, there were the question of kiddos and eating came up, and you said, for goodness sake, let's treat them like they're little humans, right? Because they are. So there's just some work involved, and it's interesting to me how they are different. I can tell a similar story with my kiddos. My two girls will crush sardines and liver with me, and they love sauerkraut, and we eat that stuff together. But dang, my son, he's got a sweet tooth, and he'll go nutty on that. So with that in mind, and we bring up this idea of how individualistic it can be, even from this neurological standpoint. How do we test for that? I mean, if you wanted to find out if you're this kind of carb processor or you're not, what's the first step with going through there?
So there's a couple of different ways that you can go with this. There's some subjective observations that you can do. So you have a meal, and people probably just in the back of their head kind of have a sense of this. Eat a particular meal, a couple hours later, you feel foggy-headed, you feel kind of lethargic, you maybe get hungry again really quickly. We get that kind of rebound hypoglycemia. That stuff's all really valuable because you don't need a piece of technology outside of yourself to get that feedback. But that said, just basically using a simple blood glucose monitor and setting up a battery of meals, and this is basically what my 7-day carb test is. I recommend that people pick a battery of carbohydrate foods that they want to check out. They have that for breakfast each day, and we try to do the same time, the same kind of situation, so that we've got, as close to a scientific experiment as we can, and we see what the blood glucose response is. And if it's below a certain level, then that's probably a good item for you. If it's above a certain level, then we'll think about reducing the carbohydrate amount and or, maybe just deleting that. But I do a combination of both. I have a battery of questions for people to ask how they feel during and after the meal, as well as getting that objective anchor of using that blood glucose monitor.
So,
and, just one other thought. I don't mention this in the book, but HRV, a heart rate variability monitor, is a really valuable tool that can give you one additional piece of kind of objective information. If we see that HRV score improving, then it means that we're under relatively low stress, things are going well. Whereas a food that may be immunogenic, like for me, wheat would be a problem. It would cause a stress response. An overly high blood glucose change going high to low will negatively impact your HRV. So even though I don't talk about it in the book, I do have on my website, when the book is released, there's going to be some suggestions for integrating HRV as an additional kind of validation tool in that whole story. But I'm not super crazy on a lot of the quantified self stuff. I think people need to spend more time just feeling what's going on in their body, and then be very selective about the tools that they use to get objective measures.
Well, I think that's interesting because, I'm kind of not fasting, but I'm kind of cutting down for a weightlifting meet that's coming up, right? So I've been going low carb. When I generally have this system where I'll just go low carb and I'll just shed pounds. It's not so hard, but it's interesting. Last night I had like 6 Skittles, right? I couldn't. They were in the thing. We had them. We do reward every now and then with the shiny candies. The kids go nuts on them, and I woke up today and felt kind of hungover on it. I couldn't believe it. You know what I mean? So it was really interesting. It was a quick little handful of that. So again, you feel it, you know it. I should avoid Skittles, or maybe it's carnauba wax. I'm not sure, but whatever's in there. So
yeah, that's interesting. I've noticed the same thing with pizza with myself. In fact, whenever I first read the Paleo Solution back in I guess it was 2000, probably 2010, right about when it came out. I remember taking pizza, like everything out for 30 days and introducing it again, and I can feel like my fingers swell now.
Right.
It sucks because I used to love pizza, and my family's Italian, and so now when they eat pizza stuff, they're like, oh, I gotta pick something else. We're gonna have a salad.
Is it just the carb content, or is it the gluten deal? Like, have you played with gluten-free pizzas?
I have. I've played with them. That doesn't bother me as much. And in fact, interestingly enough, certain types of gluten don't bother me at all. If it's the stretchy stuff. It's not just pizza, but like anything that's a stretchy kind of dough, it wrecks me. And I don't even want to
because usually they will use gluten-enriched flour for that stuff to really make it super sticky. Gluten is amazing in that regard. It really makes stuff stretchy and it rises in a nice way and all that stuff. That's interesting.
Well, I was going to say sorry, Danny. The root of the word is glue, right? I mean, if you look up the history of the word, it's glue. And honestly, my family, we were kind of broke asses at times. And when we were doing school projects and we didn't have Elmer's, we would mix glue and water, right? And I always had this intuition, like, this is kind of weird stuff to be thrown in your body if you can make, plaster out of it, right? So that's interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when I read that book back in 2010, I just thought it was very concise, and the 30-day challenge surprised my wife and I quite a bit. I think a lot of people probably have a similar experience with that. And my question for you is, I know for me, I dropped just a bunch. I dropped a bunch of weight unintentionally. I didn't really want to lose a lot of weight, but I did. And then other people don't lose any weight at all, and they're 100% strict with it. So what is the mechanism for somebody that drops maybe 15 pounds in that 30 days, and then somebody that doesn't really, they don't lose any weight whatsoever? Is there a reason why, or what does that show you?
That's a really good question, and I think that there's probably a couple of different things going on there. Like, some people, if they're entering into this metabolic derangement, insulin resistant spectrum, one of the first things that happens as insulin goes up, we release more of a hormone called aldosterone. The aldosterone causes us to retain sodium. When we retain sodium, we retain water. So we end up with elevated blood pressure, but also just elevated body weight because we're just kind of walking around with excess water. So a lot of people will notice that they eat kind of lower carb or even paleo, and they just pee a lot, and they get some diuresis. And so 8 or 10 pounds of weight may just be, they'll say just water weight, but that just water weight, you just reduced your likelihood of cardiovascular disease dramatically because we're getting out of that non-laminar flow that causes the atherogenic plaques to kind of form and whatnot. So it's a really valuable piece. And then beyond that, some people so Lauren Cordain's original recommendations for the paleo diet was that you could eat unlimited amounts of meat, fruits, vegetables, basically follow out of these categories, and you can eat unlimited amounts. That works for almost everybody, but I had a couple of clients that were able to hamstring that. Like, they were able to eat like 6,000 calories a day of that stuff, and I have no idea how they could do it. And oftentimes, like, nuts are a problem because it's a really dense calorie source. Right. We had a guy that started off with us that was over 400 pounds, and I actually mentioned him in the first book. Really funny dude. He's a lawyer, and like, nobody has ever been made to be a better lawyer than this guy. He just argues about everything. I think he argues with himself about stuff. Awesome. And so, there was all this back and forth, and he was losing a little bit of weight, but it wasn't like super dramatic. So I said, why don't you just write down what you're eating? We'll start off with that before we start weighing and measuring food. And he had like breakfast, and then there was a snack, and the snack was almonds. I'm like, how many almonds are you eating? And he's like, well, a Costco container of almonds. I'm like, oh, okay, that's 3,500 calories right there, So you get a Ziploc bag, you get 2 ounces of almonds, that's your snack. And then when we did that, like, the weight loss just took off. So there are some ways. So again, on the one hand, some of the weight loss that we see may be diuresis, it may be losing water, but that's a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad deal. And then for other people, they may inadvertently figure out ways that they're still able to get some very calorically dense meals down, and because of their activity level or their size or whatnot, that they're able to kind of stay in positive caloric intake, and they don't really get that weight loss.
Interesting. And we're on this caloric intake. Danny's bringing up weight loss, and these neurological components are interesting to me. If the male story always seems to be, I want to get big, I want to get huge, I want to do more performance-wise. Can we use this to our advantage to gain weight if we want to put on muscle and to increase performance?
Yeah, and I actually mentioned that in the new book, which is that some people that come to me, like the skinny high school student that wants to play football, he's JV and wants to go varsity. A purely paleo type diet might be challenging because it's going to be hard to get enough food down this kid's pie hole. So we will reintroduce things like white potatoes and maybe some milk or white rice and stuff like that, and get more flavor combinations as well as more nutrient dense foods, because it's going to allow him to eat more food. But then I make the point in the book that if this is the way that we get people to eat to get big, maybe we do something the opposite of that so that we don't become huge.
There you go.
Yeah, and John Welbourn and the Power Athlete guys have talked about this a lot. Like there's a back and forth between like doing a bulking phase and maybe needing to loosen up on the diet to some degree, with the amounts and types of carbohydrate. Marty Kendall, who's over at optimizingnutrition.com, he does amazing work. He's a software engineer whose wife is a type 1 diabetic. He didn't like the way that her type 1 diabetes was being managed, which was standard of care and poor. And so he got in and started retro-engineering this stuff, and he figured out a ketogenic diet was great for her, but he's really gone deep on nutrient density, and he's created these different lists, like nutrient-dense foods for fat loss, nutrient-dense foods that are insulin spiking for athletes. And so he's gone in and provided some really, really great nuance on that so that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and I just can't say enough good stuff about him. That's Marty Kendall at optimizingnutrition.com.
Yeah, check that out. That looks really interesting.
It's mind-blowing stuff. He's a brilliant guy, and that data scientist, computer engineer background has allowed him to get in and get really granular with this stuff. And he handles the data analysis of people's blood glucose and ketone levels in a really remarkable way. Like it's better than 99% of the nutrition research that's going on.
Cool.
Well, you bring up a good point, and it's that his wife had an experience with a medical provider that he wasn't happy with, and I think that for a lot of people that are they like to read and they try to stay up with current research and topics on especially nutrition and how quickly it changes. It can be a bit frustrating for people to find a physician, a general practitioner, or in some cases a dietitian or nutritionist that they want to actually work with. So do you have any simple guidelines for somebody that's looking for a physician that's trying to actually improve non-medicine based wise their health and what they should look for?
Yeah, so at the end of my last book, one of the biggest challenges that I saw was a lack of practitioners that are aggregated in this kind of ancestral health evolutionary medicine story. So I created a website, paleophysiciansnetwork.com. There's 1,000, 2,000 healthcare providers that are listed in there. Some other folks did a similar type of website called Primal Docs, and they actually manage and steward the thing, so there's a little more activity on there. None of this is vetted, so you still have to do some poking around, but for the most part, these people are they signed up on there because they have an interest in this type of functional medicine. Chris Kresser is now certifying folks in kind of a functional medicine, evolutionary medicine hybrid. He had 200 people graduate the first year out of his program, and he has 200 more people going through it. So if you look for functional medicine, evolutionary medicine, or again, paleophysiciansnetwork.com or primaldocs.com, all of those are pretty good resources to try to find someone that is likely going to have a different perspective than the basic symptom-oriented treatment paradigm that you get out of the doc in the box scene.
Well, Chris is great, and through your podcast, when I gave her that viral infection that became a baby, right? It came out of her and demanded things from her, right? So 3 times. But before the vasectomy, we got her pregnant. But Chris's healthy baby code was something I picked up through your podcast. And it's funny when I bring up the healthy baby code to the docs, we bring it in, this is what we're thinking, this is what we're doing. They'd be like, oh, this is great, but they aren't the recommendations we're allowed to give. Because we'd come out of these Liza's in the military, so we go to the doctor on the base, even when we get a midwife. So they're like, well, it just doesn't align with what we do, but we really like it. So even in that regard, do you have any questions maybe? I mean, when you, rather than just finding these docs on these sites, but a lot of times you have to not interrogate, but you can question your physician, right? Maybe that's a route to go. And for folks who want to do that, kind of keeping it classy and not just challenging the doc, or is that something folks should do?
When it's important is your health and your family's health, I think you can be a little bit of a dick in that regard.
There you go.
I want to ask some hard questions.
Yeah.
When we first started going to the pediatrician that we have, there was a little bit of a dick measuring contest between he and I. Like he's an MD, PhD in immunology, and so we were kind of back and forth, and he was open to what we were doing, but we largely just kept most of what we were up to off the discussion for the
Got
most
it.
part. We took the girls in for checkups like you're supposed to do. But then apparently one of his colleagues, who's his mentor, they were golfing or something, and he was like, oh yeah, so the mentor was talking about the paleo diet and mentioned me, and then our pediatrician was like, oh, I see his kids, and he's like, oh, that's amazing, like that guy really knows his stuff, and then after that the whole affect changed, like the guy's kind of interaction with me changed, and he actually was pretty curious. Questions that you can ask your doctor, and again, like I'm pretty geeky on this, so my
Sure.
questions are but I would say, so what do you think about an evolutionary framework for practicing medicine? Like, is it all, is this a place that we can have a conversation around this? Do you think that there's anything to be learned about modern degenerative diseases when we look at pre-Westernized societies? There's some stuff like that, which again is kind of geeky. I'm trying to think about it, for more like people who don't wear a pocket protector for their day-to-day work, and a more legitimate question. I would ask, one of the good ones is gluten sensitivity. So like, hey doc, what's your thoughts on gluten sensitivity? Not just celiac, but this whole gluten sensitivity deal. And if you get the response of, there's absolutely nothing to support this is a fad, blah, 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 I would probably bounce.
Sure.
Like, unless your issue is surgically oriented, and this is one of the best surgeons in the world on this topic, but for a general practitioner or like a pediatrician or something like that, if they're so out of touch that they don't know some of the basics around like food intolerances and gluten sensitivity and stuff like that, I would probably keep shopping. And the cool thing is, even in pretty remote areas, you're maybe a half-day drive to be able to find someone who's really good these days. And yeah, that's kind of an onerous process. But if you have a really significant health issue, like if one of your kids develops type 1 diabetes, or they've got a mitochondrial dysfunction or something like that that may respond to like a ketogenic diet, it really behooves you to get in and do some digging and find someone that can handle this in a better way than just the ICD-10, like, okay, you fit into these diagnostic categories, there's your meds, I'll see you when things get worse. Like, that's not enough for me.
Well, the book, a chapter in it seems like you're going to go very deep into other areas of health and wellness that are not necessarily just food. And it was sleep and exercise and community.
Right.
The other, I think they're called pillars. And this is, I'm assuming like you and Kirk Parsley have had some back and forth on this, because when we talked to him, he kind of had a similar framework of talking about sleep, but then hey, there's all these other things that people forget about. So why do you think it was so important to really bring that up in this book? And what are some things that people should really know about those other areas?
Oh man, I wish, and my publisher really wishes, that it could have just been food, and that was it. Like, I really wanted this thing to be 7 days to paleo abs, and and I was like, that would probably be a great book, but I am not the right person to write that book. But
that's right.
I was trying to look at this thing from the neuroregulation of appetite, and when you look at the things that influence the neuroregulation of appetite, sleep and photoperiod is huge. People who are shift workers, police, military, fire, military, new parents, when our sleep gets curtailed or altered off the normal circadian rhythm, people eat more food and they become more insulin resistant. So the food that they eat tends to get partitioned more into fat than into lean body mass. So that's a big deal. Movement's a big important piece, and not so much from like the calories burned perspective, which is what we get out of most of the mainstream kind of medical scene. I value movement because that's where your quality of life begins. Like, that is your ability to move, your ability to do things, that defines your quality of life. And some people have really lofty goals in that regard. Some people have more modest goals, but developing some basic resistance training programs so that you maintain muscle mass throughout your life, a mobility program so that we don't put undue stress on our connective tissue and joints, and then a base level of metabolic output, anaerobic and aerobic fitness. And again, depending on specific athletic goals, like, you may do more or less of that stuff, but ticking all those movement boxes, we could do a full body weightlifting circuit in a gym twice a week, and it'll take us 15 or 20 minutes to do the whole thing. So you're talking about less than an hour for that. and then you get out and hike and do that as often as you can. Part of the hike, if there's a steep uphill grade, sprint a little bit of that grade and then rest and sprint and rest, and then hit a yoga class once in a while, and I mean that you're talking about maybe a couple hours of activity a week, and hopefully like the hiking, you actually enjoy it. Like I'm at a point now where going to the gym and lifting weights is just like, oh my God, put a gun at my head. Like I'm just, I really like jujitsu a lot more, but when I do these quick circuits, I'm in, I'm out, it's no drama, no big deal. I actually follow the gymnastics bodies programming for a lot of the strength work and also the mobility work, and I enjoy that. And then more, particularly now that we're heading into spring and the weather's improving around Reno, the bulk of my like cardio is going to be getting out. I'll put one of the girls in a backpack and just go for a hike, or I'll walk with them and I'll sprint ahead and then run back to them and get some more activity with that. But I'm getting sun on my skin, getting sun in my eyes. I'm getting some good fun conditioning. And then the final piece that you mentioned is this community element, and it's something that gets missed a lot. But there's some really good research that suggests that people with inadequate social connectivity, inadequate social support, are as at high risk for morbidity and mortality, early death, early disease, as a pack-a-day smoker. And so it's kind of crazy. People will eat grass-fed meat and they'll wear blue blockers and go to bed early and exercise, and then they end up in this like socially isolated situation, which is creating all the other good stuff aside. Now they've created a situation in which they have a pack-a-day smoking habit risk because of the stress of lack of connectivity. And so I recommend some things like CrossFit, or again yoga, or martial arts, or a running group, or civic groups, or church, or what have you. Like that's a really important piece of our human existence. We evolved in small group environments, and there's a stress component to not having healthy, loving relationships. And so that's another piece that's really important to tying this whole thing together. And even though CrossFit can be a mixed bag, it's interesting, a really well-run gym that's in that genre, if the coach knows what they're doing, they're going to talk to you about sleep and photo period. They're going to talk to you about good food. The exercise is baked in the cake. That's kind of why you show up. And there's usually a really good community. So, something like a functional fitness CrossFit type gym, if it's well run, excuse me, it ticks all those boxes, and it's hard to find anything else that really does that.
That's interesting, and the community aspect is something. It's the reason that I'll still compete in weightlifting, really, because I like going to the meets. I like shaking hands. I like mixing it up with folks, and it's always fun. It's, it sounds to me like more than just drinking alone. We shouldn't really do much alone, right? I mean, we need folks around us, and I'm always amazed when you hear things like that. And really good health seems to boil around, surround yourself with folks that make you happy, eat real food, breathe through your nose, stand up, that kind of stuff. And people are out of their minds trying to look for like the black walnut, cutting board that's going to keep their meat antimicrobial, rather than just like concentrating on the basics. So where else do you think folks might be, one of the places I think where folks overdo that is supplementation, right? They're always looking for the extra stuff. But we do know that there is value in doing some supplementation. What's the low-hanging fruit in that regard for folks if they need to just check some boxes they can't get it through natural diet?
Vitamin D and the related vitamins K2 and vitamin A, I think are really underconsumed and underappreciated in their importance. Iron is a really important factor, both from a deficiency and an excess perspective. Like there are a lot of men who are running around with a mild to moderate excess iron load, which is an oxidative stress. It impairs their insulin sensitivity. It increases the likelihood of all kinds of inflammatory diseases.
Can we hang out there for a minute on that? Because I'm a liver eater. I cook it in a cast iron skillet. You know what I mean? Like I'm hitting the weight. So how do we recognize that deficiency? And then and imagine the only way to fix it is to draw blood or something. I mean, what do we have to do in that regard?
I will actually punt you guys to Chris Masterjohn.
Okay.
He's doing a series currently that's looking at like the nutrients that he feels are really, really important. And so the first one he kicked off though was iron, and he had noticed a really interesting set of circumstances that when he donated blood, he felt better for like a week, and then he started feeling less good. And it was just like foggy-headed and joint aches and stuff like that, but low-grade inflammation. And he didn't have hemochromatosis, but he had elevated hematocrit. His iron saturation was kind of maxed out. His ferritin was maxed out. And so he kind of put together that he probably had some low-grade iron overload. So he started donating blood every 8 weeks. But he has a great series, chrismasterjohnphd.com, and then you check out his podcast, and then he also has some show notes on that stuff. But he goes through selenium, vitamins A, D, and K, vitamin E, iron, like I mentioned. He's doing an amazing job on that, and like I'm not qualified to carry that guy's gym bag when you start talking about, specific nutrient stuff. So I would kind of punt people towards him in that series that he's doing. But, just really quickly, the vitamin A, D, and K story is an important one to address. You probably want to get the vitamin D levels checked. And then you also want to supplement the K2 and the A in synergy with the vitamin D, because there's a lot of folks that were vitamin D deficient that are supplementing with vitamin D, but without the K2 and the vitamin A, we get some of the benefits from vitamin D, but we can end up with some like increasing vascular calcium deposits, which aren't good, and some other kind of pro-inflammatory issues, because all those nutrients typically exist in nature in synergy. Like the food that you get the A from, you get the D and the K also, or what have you. So I would look at those, and I would definitely check out some of the stuff around iron deficiency for women, and then iron overload for men. Or if you have a postmenopausal woman, having her consider the possibility that she may be in an iron overload situation.
Well, I know we have just a few more minutes with you, and this topic that I want to bring up, you could probably talk about for hours, but there's been a lot of press on gut health and these fermented foods adding to your diet, and looking at the microbiome and all that, and what's your stance on the approach to the microbiome, and should people be adding a lot more fermented foods into what they eat in a day-to-day kind of diet?
Oh, that's a great question, and
good job, Danny.
That's 3 times he said that, by the way. I just want to point that out. That's 3 great questions.
My answer is going to be much less great. It's my understanding of this situation right now is that we understand that the gut microbiome is a critical feature of our health. There are some folks out there that claim to have a really deep understanding about if you have A, B, C, D, E microbiome, then that means good things or bad things. And I think there's some trends, but it's we're really a long ways away from like being targeted in the specific strains that you should have. There might be a few exceptions to that, but there's we're going to know more in 5 years than we've learned in the last 50 years with regards to the gut microbiome. And I think that the story is going to be one of immense complexity that can't really be managed on a parts and pieces basis. We're going to have to pull back and do kind of an outcome-based macro intervention. I think some of those macro interventions are actually going to be around things like fecal transplant. Like you basically find someone who has a reasonably similar genetic profile to you. They seem to be healthy. Their gut microbiome doesn't look overtly pathological. And then maybe we'll try transferring their gut microbiome into you if you have like celiac disease or Crohn's or something like that. I did a blog post maybe 2 weeks ago talking about giant pandas and their gastrointestinal evolution. And so they've been eating bamboo for like 2 to 3 million years, like a long time. But interestingly, their gastrointestinal physiology and their microbiome still looks like that of an omnivore or a carnivore, which is really interesting. And they actually have a lot of GI problems. Like they are not that well adapted to eating this diet of bamboo. And it was really perplexing for the researchers because the microbiome that they had was, typical of a carnivore, but clearly these pandas are getting some nutrition out of this. Like somewhere in there, something is causing what's called cellulosic fermentation. Like it's kind of like the bacteria and termite guts that break down the cellulose and provide some substrate for the animal to break down and use that. So what could happen there is that they're looking at specific species of bacteria that usually are associated with a carnivore, but one of those species of bacteria may have obtained a gene that allows it to break down cellulose. So this may become a story where we're not looking at specific bacterial species, but we're going to look at the genes that encode specific proteins and enzymes, and that's really what we're going to be looking at. But that's a whole other layer of complexity in this story. Like, not only do you need to figure out the specific, species or genre of the bacteria in question, we need to go a layer deeper and say, well, what genes do they actually carry?
Does it match a genetic code that it's square peg, square hole type deal? That's interesting.
It's really complex, and some people do really, really well with the addition of fermented food. Some people, if they have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, it makes the condition worse. There are these things called FODMAPs, these fermentable carbohydrates that some people do great on. And interestingly, the FODMAPs are basically considered prebiotic sources. So in a healthy gut, you should be eating tons of garlic and onions and squash and what have you. Someone that maybe has a damaged gut, like maybe they went on tetracycline from the age of 13 to 24, that would be me.
Antibiotic. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm still trying to figure out what I need to do. Like, do I have a pathogenic profile of, say, like E. coli that is pushing out or Clostridium that is pushing out the more beneficial bacteria, and so I'm getting a lipopolysaccharide toxicity from the cell membranes of these bacteria shedding and going into my system and causing inflammation. These are all possibilities, and even though I'm way healthier than what I was 20 years ago, I still have some GI stuff. Like, I'm not as bulletproof and robust as what I would like, so I'm still trying to figure that out. But all of the standard gut microbiome testing that I've done, it's like, no, you're not carrying Clostridium, you don't have abnormal levels of E. coli. So it's like, what the hell do I have going on? And some people who have GI problems, there's a theory that our genetics are actually expecting us to be parasitically infested. There's a certain low-grade kind of inflammatory response that the gut actually wants because of that. And there are some people who have Crohn's disease that have experienced complete reversal of the condition when they are infected with a type of pinworm that doesn't take up permanent residence in humans. It has a very abbreviated life cycle, and then it dies and it's shedded, but the infectious process appears to put the Crohn's disease into remission. And these people, once a year, once every 2 years, may need to get reinfected with this pinworm to be able to remain completely free of the Crohn's disease. But that's really fascinating, that there may be a need for a parasitic infectious exposure for some people to actually keep them on an even keel. So I mean, it's a really complex, kind of mind-blowing topic, and I thought that endocrinology and protein, carbs, fat were complex, and man, it's child's play compared to what we're discovering in this gut microbiome story. So again, I apologize. Like, your question was really good, and either the topic is still way more complex than what I could give an answer, or I'm just too ignorant on the topic to really give it a really good go. But I think that we're going to learn a ton. But interestingly, I still think it's going to be very simple solutions that end up being the clinically important application. Like, we're going to try to find all kinds of targeted therapeutics around specific bacterial strains and stuff like that. And I have a sneaky suspicion that really granular approach is not really going to work. It's going to be more of like the poop milkshake, turkey baster, that type of thing. That's actually going to be where we get the greatest results.
Yeah, this the battle in the belly, right, is really interesting. I know that I kind of like to treat the fermented stuff, or even probiotic natural ones, as a bit of its own food group. I'm always going to snack on kraut. I'll put kefir in my protein shake. I'll sip on some fermented kombucha, some things like that, and among other things. But and I do it for the kiddos too. I think it's good. I've noticed when I do it, at least my my bowels firm up a little bit to me, and that's a good sign. So I think that's the way to go there in that regard. But too, and I guess you can't beat yourself up for being ignorant on that gut biome, because supposedly it's trillions and trillions of little buggies in there, and what's it, 21 pounds of these things, and it's just there needs to be a bunch more in terms of, I guess, classification and just detecting those things, and that's a big thing on its own. But
yeah, and that's a really good point, and I mentioned a study that came out of Israel a couple of years ago, and this was actually kind of my inspiration for how I drive the personalized nutrition in the book. But what these folks did is they got 800 people that they put a continuous blood glucose monitor on. It's a little probe that goes through the skin, and it checks blood glucose once a minute for the duration of the study, which for these folks was 2 or 3 weeks. They did a full gut microbiome analysis. They did a full genetic analysis on these people. They did extensive lab work, lipidology, and whatnot. And they just started feeding people meals and seeing what their blood glucose response was and inflammatory responses. And stuff was all over the map. Like, some people would eat a banana and have near diabetic blood glucose response. Other people would eat a chocolate chip cookie and they had a barely perceptible blood glucose response. And there wasn't a lot that the researchers could figure out initially, but they started pumping this through one of these supercomputers, machine learning algorithms, and the machine learning algorithm was able to start sorting the connectivity between the genetics, the epigenetics of the gut microbiome, and some other features. And they got to a spot where they were able to say, okay, based off your gut microbiome and your genetics, we think that your blood glucose response will be favorable with these foods, unfavorable with these foods. And then they tested that, and it was totally spot on. And that may be where we get to at some point. But again, what's really happening there is a really big picture kind of correlation process. We don't know really what's going on, but we know that, okay, given this genetic profile, this epigenetic profile of gut microbiota, there's a pretty good likelihood that these foods are going to be favorable for you, these foods unfavorable. And so that is another layer to the story that I think we're going to see roll out in the future. But again, I mean, that's a very macro approach. It's not like we're getting in and doing one targeted, microbiome therapeutic like Akkermansia supplementation or something like that.
Well, it would almost seem, too, the other thing that would screw that up is behavior. It seems like humans are notorious for we can get the plan, but then we'll screw it up, right? We'll get in a car, we'll get someone pregnant, we'll do something stupid, we'll lose our job, we'll be unhappy, and then we'll have to correlate behavior with all that. But we humans, we're complicated, man. It's an interesting problem that we've created for ourselves by just evolving and living, right?
Right. Well, Robb, thanks so much for your time today. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure if anybody wants to reach out to you, find out more information about what you have going on, not just the Wired to Eat, which comes out March 21st, so make sure you head over to Amazon and get that bad boy. But where can they go find out more information about you, podcasts, all that stuff you got going on?
Most of my stuff lives at robbwolf.com, ROBBWOLF.com, and I'm not sure when this podcast is going up, but folks who pre-order the book, if you go to robbwolf.com/wired to eat, WIREDTOEAT, we have a bunch of really cool pre-order bonuses, and I think that those bonuses either go away on the 21st or we may extend it for a week or something after that, so the people that buy in like a brick and mortar setting or buy the week of, they can take advantage of that. But there's some really cool stuff. There's a workbook that helps you navigate the 30-day reset and the 7-day carb test. There's a chapter that used to be chapter 1 of the book called Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. And it's actually my favorite chapter of the book. It lays out all the historical underpinnings of the economic, political, and academic kind of chicanery that went into our modern food environment. I really like that chapter, but the publishers were like, no way, man, your book's already 400 pages, so this thing's gone. And then what else do we have? I have an interview with Dr. William Cromwell, who's the head of cardiovascular disease research at Liposcience and LabCorp. And we go through the blood work that I recommend in the book, talk about the basic lab panels versus the stuff that we kind of recommend with regards to advanced testing. There's one other thing that I'm forgetting, but there's some pretty cool swag, and all of that's going to be available for the folks that do pre-orders. If they go to that website, robbwolf.com/wired to eat, it will describe to you where to send your copy of your receipt and then we will paint you all that stuff.
Well, that's cool. And I don't know if Chris let you know this, but we've also hooked up. We got together with Inside Tracker, and what we're going to end up doing, we're going to get together and folks who we're going to have a bit of a giveaway ourselves, where we'll have a you get a blood panel from Inside Tracker, you get a $100 gift certificate to Whole Foods, you get a copy of your book, and then we're also going to include our Everyday's Back Day program to get the movement component in there too. So, guys, jump on board. This book is great. There's some cool content on board with that, and it's cool, man. You know that. I'm going to pre-order it because that chapter 1, it seems to be awesome for maybe those guys who dabble in conspiracy theories and what we've done in the background for that. So I'm excited to check that out.
It's pretty good stuff, and I have to say, some of my funnier, wittier, kind of snarky stuff is in that chapter 1. So
Awesome.
I was really gutted when they wanted to pull it out, but I'm glad that we found a way to repurpose it. So if you're gonna get the book, like, doing the pre-orders are kind of worth it for the extra swag that you get.
Well, very cool, guys.
Oh, and by the way, just so you guys know, I've been using the Everyday is Back Day, like, since you guys sent that to me.
Oh, really?
I totally brain-faded on that. Like, I pulled stuff out of that constantly. That is an amazing resource.
Well, I'll tell you what's cool about that is a big inspiration for writing that was I trained a girl who wanted to be a weightlifter, but she just was coming off of diastasis what I'm trying to diastasis. I never say it right, but I know how to fix it a little bit, so we'll work that out. But really cool, Rob. Glad you appreciate that program, guys. That was the snarky Smurf, Robb Wolf. There, I'm Coach Joe, the vasectomized weightlifter. Doc Danny, the man with the plan. If you guys need any issues fixed mobility wise, guys, and this is the Doc and Jock podcast, proving, gang, that if you have a body. Cool, Rob. That was fun, man. Cool. That's cool that Everyday's Back Days worked for you. You're that's great feedback. So that was helpful.
Yeah,
Awesome.
It's genius. It's really good. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah, it's been fun, man. We've gotten stuff like, I just worked my way up to clean and jerking 400 pounds. Like one of Joe's athletes did that I put my dad on it so he'd get back to playing